the thing for me that changed aviation forever is having all this information that was proprietary, ubiquitous to the world. Find deals that were based on relationships alone, and they were supplanted by this universal access to data.
This is the Time on Wing podcast, the podcast where we discuss the professionals of the aviation industry. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me, as always, is Garrick Deschavant of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who are we talking to today?
Good morning, Courtney. And we've got somebody that I'm honored to have him on board. He has definitely been in the industry for quite some time, and I'm sure he's got some great stories to tell us. So today we're going to be talking with Ron Anderson. And Ron Anderson is currently a managing member of Alpha Aviation Partners. But before that, he has done quite a bit. And so he was and is founder and CEO of Velos Aviation. He was the founder and CEO of different variations of Intrepid Aviation. So there was Intrepid Aviation Management, Intrepid Aviation Partner Group, and Intrepid Aviation LLC. He was also president, Director of Aircraft Sales and Acquisitions, Managing Director of Contracts, and in-house counsel for Federal Express Aviation Services, a little company you might have heard of. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Rhodes College and received a Juris Doctorate from the University of Memphis. And he has also been president and a board member of ISTAT, and he was actually one of the helping founders of ISTAT in 1982. So it's going to be pretty exciting. For the few times that I've met him, he's got some really fun stories. So I think he's been around the industry for some time, and it's going to be really exciting to talk to him today. So, Ron, this is your time on wing.
Thank you guys for doing this, by the way. I mean, this is a service that people need to appreciate more, because it's this way that a lot of things in aviation will be remembered after the rest of us have retired. So thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. And and it always amazes me, and I'm sure Courtney as well, when just talking to people about like their background, where they came from, and this obviously was the basis for this, but it's just kind of like there's so many like interesting stories and interesting backgrounds about, especially when I think back to really when aviation kind of got started, it was like the Wild West. When you hear some of the stories, I mean, I remember some of the stuff that when I worked for CIT and some of the things that they were talking about the stories of what they were doing. And, in terms of like, oh yeah, we had to repossess this airplane. We're getting shot at trying to get the airplane out. Or we went to this hotel and, this guy, and the well-known name would be put out there, took the TV and threw it out the window. And you're like, what? Like just crazy stories. And I'm like, I don't hear those stories today. It's very much more tame today. But anyway, it's fascinating. But, so what I like to do, with all of our guests is just kind of get your take on, when you got started in aviation and where the passion came from, in terms of when you started becoming interested in aviation and how that started. So I'd love to hear from you in terms of where that began.
From a DNA perspective, my dad was a naval aviator, and he was enlisted on December 8th, 1941 into the Navy after a certain event out in the South Pacific, and was first sent to aerial gunnery school, and then sent to what was then the forerunner of submarine detection gear. So he was the officer on board the airplane that operated the MAD gear, and he started with a Catalina PB2Y3. And then after the war, he was in the Naval Reserves flying in the P3, operating some more sophisticated gear. But the reserves, we lived in Paris, Tennessee, and Millington, which was the largest naval inland naval air base in the United States, which is 20 miles north of Memphis. We would drive down there every month because my dad had reserve duty. And when I was 14 years old, we started leaving. He had to be there at 7. It was a 2.5-hour drive. At 14, I drove him there while he slept, preparing for his Navy duty. But I got to hang around, and there were two squadrons there at that point in time. And, the airplanes got under my skin. So, as I say, it was DNA. But it all got started in a real way. I had just graduated from law school at the University of Memphis. And I was sitting out by the pool at my apartment complex, and I had a six-pack of Coors, which you couldn't buy in Tennessee at that point in time, and a law book.
This isn't when you're 14 years old and driving, right?
This is after law school.
God. Yeah, you made.
So you were
made it finish
16.
law school
16.
at 15. Yeah.
Accelerate a little bit there through Rhodes College and then University of Memphis Law School. But I'm sitting out by the pool at the apartment, and a guy comes walking by, and he sees the law book leaning up against the beer, and he sat down, introduced himself, and he was getting a divorce. He was asking me all these questions about divorce, which I knew just what I'd learned in law school at that point. But I said, "What do you do?" And he says, "I'm the Senior Vice President of Industrial Relations for Federal Express." I'd never heard of him. And so we talked for about an hour, and he said, "I think we're looking for a lawyer." So he writes this guy's name down on a sheet of paper, and he says, "You ought to give him a call." So the next morning, which is Wednesday, I give this guy a call. He says, "We've already offered the job to someone else, but why don't you come on out this afternoon? Let's visit." So I drive out to the airport. I can't find him. And I stop at several service stations around. Nobody's ever heard of them. So I finally stumble on the place. It's a bunch of Quonset huts there at Memphis. Long story short, we spent about 2 hours and had a great time. And he says, "Look, if for some reason this guy doesn't take the job, would you be interested?" Friday morning, the phone rang. He says, "Can you start Monday?" So that's how I got to FedEx. And the first day that I arrived, he says, "I have the investors. You have everything else." And I go, "Oh my God," because I'm right out of law school. I know nothing about anything. And so it was a baptism by fire. But that started my career at FedEx. And FedEx was losing $1 million a month. We had 400 people at that point in time. And today there's over 500,000, but we'll get to that later. But it was an incredible time in terms of what was going on, what I was exposed to. But we were opening 3 stations per week, which required someone to go negotiate an operating agreement with the airport, find a facility. So they said, "Hey, Mr. Lawyer, in order to expedite this, you're going to go with our head of properties, who's going to fly you in a Piper Arrow, and you're going to go around and take a look and help him get this done quicker." So we're in the Piper Arrow on the air runway, and he said, "You ever flown an airplane?" I said, "Nope." He says, "Well, you're about to right now." And he was a CFI. So we take off, and I'm at the controls. We fly up to St. Louis. We do all the get-goes with the airport authority there. We then fly to Peoria. We do the get-go there with the airport. We're leaving there going to Toledo. And as we're in Peoria, the most god-awful storm you've ever seen goes through. So I'm sitting there in the right seat, and he's flying, and we're headed to Toledo. We fly through this storm. And I said, "There's something wrong about this picture." So when we got back to Memphis, I said, "Nobody will ever make the decision for me to fly unless I make that decision, so I learn to fly." And so that got me on the airplane side. But we were, at that point in time, FedEx, and this is a great story, and I call it the express freighter story. When FedEx started, Fred Smith, of course, is the founder of FedEx, and he had just got out of the military and had spent 2 tours of duty in Vietnam as a OE-10 pilot. But he had the concept of FedEx. Everybody's heard the story about him getting C on his paper at Yale in terms of the whole idea of FedEx. And he was trying to find the right airplane to start FedEx with. So the longer story here is, back in the late 60s, Juan Trippe, the chairman of Pan Am, decided that they weren't allowed to fly domestically in the United States because of the CAB regulations at that point in time. So Tripp said, we're going to get some corporate jets to funnel our business travelers into gateways. So he hired this guy named Charles Lindbergh to go find the airplane. So Lindbergh goes to de Havilland, he goes to Lear, he goes all over the place. And he's on vacation in France with Anne Morrow, his wife, and gets a call from this guy by the name of Marcel Dassault. Dassault says, I have the airplane for you. So Lindbergh flies down to Marignac, which is in Bordeaux, and sees an airplane called the Mystere 20. And Lindbergh looks at it. He calls John Borger, who was a legendary engineer at Pan American. Borger comes over and says, if you will re-engine the airplane with a GE engine, and if you will change the avionics to Collins, we'll buy 100. Sacre bleu! And so they ordered 100 airplanes. Well, a couple years later, before they get any of them, Tripp changes his mind. And they have 100 airplanes coming with no place to put them. So they start Pan Am business jets. And the staffed it with a guy named Jim Taylor. If you know anything about business airplanes, Taylor is a legend. And he put together a staff of guys, and they sold all the airplanes except 23, and the global economy had fallen off a cliff. And this would have been in the early 70s. And they parked the 23 airplanes out in the desert in the United States. And along comes this guy from Memphis looking for airplanes, sees these 23 airplanes parked there, negotiates an option with Pan Am to buy the airplanes, has no money. So he goes to Lester Crown, who was the chair and owner, along with a few other folks at TWA at the time, convinces Lester Crown to guarantee a loan to buy the airplanes. The next year, the value of the airplanes goes this way and doubles. So the equity in those 23 airplanes helped start FedEx.
Interesting. And why did the values double?
The demand for corporate airplanes just skyrocketed. And it was kind of like some instances today, there was no inventory. So if you had inventory, it's kind of like having a 737-8 or an A320neo right now. You can't find them. Same thing then. So just fortuitous occurrence again. But that's how, the airplane side started at FedEx. And the later on, you're talking about the Wild Wild West earlier. As we started buying airplanes, we were looking for airplanes. We were still regulated by the CAB. So we couldn't operate an airplane that had more than 7,500 pounds capacity. So we were looking for an airplane. We were approached by Canadair. Canadair had acquired Bill Lear's airplane design called the CL. They renamed it the CL600. FedEx ordered 25 CL600s in 1976. And that was to be the next airplane beyond the Falcon. Well, then all of a sudden they deregulated air cargo in 77, a year before the passenger side. They were too small for us. They came to us and said, we want you to stay involved in the program. So we kept 5 positions. And over the space of about 18 months, we sold 4 of those positions and garnered the first corporate jet that FedEx ever had for operating for the executives out of it. But we'd gone through that. Now we're sitting there looking, where do we go now that we can buy any size airplane that we want to? And so that's when the decision was made at FedEx to buy the 727. And back to the reference to the Wild Wild West, at that point in time, I'd been a lawyer there for about 3.5 years. And they said, look, you know airplanes, you know how to fly, you've worked on these deals. How would you like to set up the department to buy and sell all the airplanes at FedEx? And I said, yes, in a nanosecond. And a decision I'll never regret. But I was thrown in to this wild, wild West environment with the likes of George Batchelor, Jinx Caldwell, Rosenbaum. I mean, these are the kind of the ancillary characters. Then on the airline side, you had people like Bob Weisenbeek at Continental, the Horace Bowling at Braniff, Tom McGinnity at Northwest, Doug Dunn at Delta. And these were the guys that were trading and buying airplanes. There weren't really many leasing companies at that point in time. Now, Batchelor was the first, and then obviously, ultimately, Steve Haase became the guru. But so that was kind of the atmosphere that was there at the time. And a quick example, I was sent to, Fred said, we'd just bought, was it 6 airplanes from United, and they were 727-100Cs that had never been operated as freighters, but they'd ordered them with the door. And we got those, and we were looking for anyone we could get. So Lon Chile came up and had 2 airplanes. So he said, get to Santiago as quickly as you can. So we hopped on an airplane, flew to New York, flew a 747-100 on Pan Am to Rio, arrived in Rio to go to Santiago 3 days before Rio started requiring passports from U.S. citizens to gain entry and visas. We had no visa. So they impounded our passports and said, you'll get out on the first airplane available. So about 18 hours later, having been in the airport, we find a seat on an airplane, an Avianca airplane going from Rio to Buenos Aires, where in Buenos Aires we're to catch an Air France flight. So again, long story short, we finally get to Santiago. The bid is in 2 days, and I met George Batchelor for the first time, and this guy, Jinx Caldwell. I had no idea who they were. All I knew was I had to come home with the airplanes. And it was a bid, and long story short, we won the bid. And it was not after a lot of shenanigans that went on in the background about other people trying to get the same airplanes. But so that started out, that was my first real airplane acquisition at FedEx. Over the next 10 years.
Before we move beyond that, how does one show up in Santiago? It's two 727-100s, right?
Yeah.
How does one just buy those in 2 days?
Well, it took about a month.
Oh,
I was
okay.
there for a month.
Okay.
And my wife's sister married the founder of Holiday Inn, a guy named Kimmons Wilson. And I knew that they had Holiday Inn, so I called the Holiday Inn folks in Memphis. I said, who did you use as a lawyer there? And I got the name of a lawyer, and he had been Citibank's lawyer and a couple of other folks. He was masterful, and he knew the folks at Lon at that point in time, was able to get me introductions in there. So it was, again, pre-preparation work before I got there that allowed it to take place. And as I say, the shenanigans that went on is what you could expect. What then was a third world country, and it wasn't pleasant. And being a lawyer, I wasn't going to get involved in any of that. All I knew was I was going to put in a bid, and if I had the highest bid, I'd win. And that was not exactly how it got played out later. But it ended up being fine. And by the way, when we took the first airplane home, we hired a Lon crew to fly it for us, along with a FedEx 2 pilots. I got to fly the 7-2 on the flight home, which is the first time I'd ever flown a big airplane. I didn't take off and land the airplane. It was just in flight. And but it's those types of moments. One of the helps when we first started in the acquisition side, George Dutton, who was the head of airplane trading at Eastern Airlines. George was the first president of ISTAT, which we'll talk more about later. But George and I became close friends, and their lawyer, Roland Moore. I don't know if either of you know Roland or not. Roland's been extremely active in ISTAT and is a historian of, in fact, that's a guy you need to talk to at some point in time to do this podcast.
Put him on the list, Garrett.
And
what was that? Was Roland? What was the last name?
Moore.
Okay. All right.
M-O-R-E.
Yep.
And he was a lawyer for Eastern, but he was involved. He's probably the only other person I can think of that had more crazy situations than I did in the airplane business. But again, it was wild, wild west. Bob Weisenbeek that I mentioned from Continental. Bob had been in Buenos Aires trying to buy and sell some airplanes there. He had to be picked up at 2:00 in the morning because another group that was trying to buy the airplanes put a hit on him. And he had to be ferreted out of the country before he was to be taken out. So,
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say shenanigans, you mean like murder.
yeah.
That's a kind word to use for
that's just
that
so
kind of,
indicative. Yeah. That's the wild west for
euphemism.
you. You're like, shenanigans,
was.
you know.
Well,
Yeah, it's amazing to me how where we've gone from, back then to today, right? Over the course of I guess 50 years, right? That sounds about right.
Garrick, I personally know of a couple failed hits on you.
Yeah. You couldn't find anybody to do it. Was that your problem? No, you couldn't pay enough.
No comment.
No comment. Oh, that's good to know. That's good to know.
in about 10 months, I will have been in this business for 50 years. So
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome.
And so when did you start at then Federal Express?
I started in June of 1974. And,
74. So you had 3 years in the regulated environment, and then you kind of mentioned the switch. And that must have been just, just fundamentally altering to the FedEx business. I mean, we hear a lot about the passenger side, but just the impact on the cargo side, it must have just been earth shaking.
It was monumental for us. And, again, in terms of economics, the bigger an airplane is, the lower cost per pound that you can generate typically. And the Falcons, the yields when we started the business were such that, a small airplane that carried 6,000 pounds would work fine because we started making money with those. But the amount of money that we can make with a larger airplane was exponential to us. In fact, that day that it was announced, I was on a Falcon on the jump seat going someplace, and they got the pilot, radioed the pilots and said, deregulation's passed, we're going to be buying big airplanes. So it was huge for the company. And the first group of airplanes were the 6 at United. Then we bought 7 more from United. Then we bought 14 from Eastern. And then it just ramped up big time. And at that point in time, we started having some competition. Emory Air Freight decided to go into the airplane business. And so they were out trying to acquire airplanes. And Jim Neff, who is at Western Global, Jim was the acquisitions guy at Emory. I got to know Jim then. And so we were competing. They ended up getting the Northwest 727s. We were after any 727 that had a cargo door. And they built a total of 145 of those in the beginning. And FedEx ended up with a predominant piece of it. In 84, this company with brown trucks called UPS decided it wanted to start an airline. So they became a competitor as well. And over the years, the groups of us competed very aggressively against each other. The next biggest decision for FedEx came in 83 when we decided we needed a bigger airplane. And it was between the 747-200 and the DC-10. Fred's concern at that point in time was if you could fill the 7.4, the economics worked, but if you didn't fill it, the economics could kill you compared to the DC-10. Continental Airlines had bought 8 DC-10-10s with freight doors in order to be eligible for craft points with the military. And they never used them as freighters. So we negotiated a contract in early 1984 to buy 4 of those airplanes. And I never will forget, Bob Weisenbeek was the guy selling the airplanes for Continental. And he said, how in the hell are you going to fill up this airplane with little boxes? First night that airplane flew, it was full.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So where, if you remember, where did that airplane fly? Was the DC-10 just used on heavy domestic routes? Did they launch
Yes,
international
yes.
service?
No, international came much later, but
Interesting.
the 1010s were used L.A. and New York, Atlanta. Those were Chicago. Those were the big points at that time. And we bought those four. Continental had four more. Fred didn't want to make the commitment right then. And I love this story. I'm at the Paris Air Show, and I'm in the Boeing Chalet. I get paged, and it's Fred. He said, I want you to get on an airplane to LA, which is where Continental's headquarters was at the time, as quickly as you can and get those other airplanes tied up. Yes, sir. So I get in, go back to the hotel, pack up, get on the airplane, fly to LA. I'm in the airport. I get paged at the airport. It's Fred. Ron, I've changed my mind.
To what? What did he change his mind to? He just didn't want the airplanes?
He's just decided we didn't need the airplanes. So I have to go to Continental, who's expecting me to come in the door and buy the airplanes and spin some story about, well, we're not buying the airplanes. And now, another piece of history here. Frank Lorenzo, who was Texas International at this point in time, wanted to acquire Continental. Continental did not want Lorenzo to acquire them. And a guy named Al Feldman was the CEO and president, former Frontier at Continental. And they were going to use the money from our acquisition of those airplanes, plus some other funds they'd lined up to resist his takeover. When that didn't occur, they lost those funds. And so Al Feldman committed suicide.
That's incredible.
That was the Wild
wow.
West. That was the Wild West of those days, right?
And I got to tell you, it really did impact me though, because
I could imagine.
it wasn't me. It was a series of things. No one knew what was going on in his life at that point in time.
Yeah.
But I mean, it just gutted me for a while. So,
I bet. Yeah.
But ultimately, we did buy the four airplanes. So,
Ultimately, yeah. Wow. Which, I mean, at that point, you were probably somewhat limited in terms of what you could go after, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that was on the 1010s. There was one other airplane that United had that we ultimately got. But then we started looking at the DC-1030, which there had been, there were airplanes at World Airways, Transamerica, and Transamerica had three. And the problem was on the DC-1030, they had an elevator to move the
galleys,
carts
right?
and things,
Yeah.
galleys up and down. So in order to turn it into a full freighter, you had to remove that elevator.
Oof.
So we negotiated with Transamerica. Hank Cuff, who was the chair of Transamerica, later on helped UPS start their airline, but he was at Transamerica at the time. I reached him negotiating the deal. He was playing golf at Pebble Beach, and we talked on the phone. He recorded our offer on a Pebble Beach scorecard, which I have framed in my office at home.
That's great.
And that was the deal to buy those three DC-10s. They had an engineer at Transamerica who was a genius. He went to Douglas, helped Douglas come up with an STC to remove that elevator. And within 6 months, we had those three airplanes in the fleet. I mean, that would take 3 years, something like that today.
For today, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Engineering resources. But, that opened up. World Airways had 8 DC-1030CFs. We ended up acquiring those 8 airplanes as well. And a lot of other crazy stories of that I won't go into, although I will go into one. Earlier, Fred Smith had gone to see Ed Daly, who was the chair and owner of World Airways. Now, Daly's reputation, he had this green Convair 440 called the Shamrock that he flew around in his personal airplane. And it, as I said, very colorful character. So Fred Smith goes out to Oakland to visit with Ed Daly. And Ed said, and Ed had a little bit of a drinking problem. So he wanted to go to a bar. So Fred said, sure. So off they go to the bar. They're sitting in the bar, and Ed doesn't get waited on quick enough. So he pulls a gun out of his pocket and shoots the pistol into the roof of the bar.
Yeah, that'll work.
Yeah. They got a lot of, then it was still the Wild Wild West. So it wasn't quite like it would be today.
Yeah, that would get anybody's attention in my book. But, yeah.
Yeah, but here's what I don't understand is if somebody pulls out a gun and shoots it in the air, the next thing you think of isn't, we should probably give this guy alcohol.
Right.
But he's Ed Daly. He owned everything around the place. So,
yeah.
But, Fred being the Vietnam vet, he hit the floor.
Yeah,
of course.
So I think the next ISTAT is at Austin, right? We should definitely try that to get attention. I think, Courtney, you should definitely just, and we're meeting people, just kind of shoot the gun in the air, see what happens, just people will remember us.
Yeah,
they will definitely remember our...
That's what happens.
One more quick story that you got to hear. Early on in the days with the Falcon, the GE engine that I mentioned that Borger wanted on the airplane was a turbine engine that the fan was in the back of the engine. So you had what was called buckets, which are both half turbine, half fan blade. And the engine that was on the Condor 880 and 990 had a fan in the back of the engine. But the problem was those engines had been built for corporate jets. And the overhaul, hot section inspection, so forth, were every 1,000 hours. When you put something in an airline operation, that will kill you. So Fred said, this can't be. So he flew up to GE to Lynn, which is where they made the smaller engines at that point in time. And there was, this guy's name's going out of my head. Herman, he was the CEO of GE Engines. Listen to Fred. He says, come on, I want you to go for a ride with me on my motorcycle. So they go out for a ride on the motorcycle and come back. He said, we will change the hot section if you do this, this, and this to the engines from 1,000 to 1,600, which is incredible. I mean, that sounds nothing 60%. Today. But because of what he did, the relationship between GE and FedEx was like this. And today, I mean, there are Rolls engines and Pratt engines inside FedEx, but a predominant of the fleet is GE. And you do something for Fred Smith, he never forgets. So, but I can't think the guy's last name, but it just a circumstance, because of the magnetism between those two guys, he says, I'm going to make this happen for you. So, and GE did, and GE is now on the 777, the 76, the A300s. So,
yeah, that's incredible. Wow. Yeah. I mean, you know what? If the podcast ended right now, I think we've got tremendous stories, but we can keep going, which is great.
But it won't.
But it won't end
right now.
Yeah, no, and it won't end right now.
Look, yeah. I love this era of aircraft, right? And I think back, if you, as you were involved in the acquisition process, I think to the campaigns at the time, or the choices at the time, right? The DC-10, the 727, I think was kind of just de facto. But what's missing, and I believe it's missing from FedEx's history until they bought Tiger, is the DC-8. Am I correct?
Well, we looked at the 707, the DC-8, the DC-1020, the DC-1040, you name it, the DC-9, the Fokker. We looked at the F-28 as a freighter. There's nothing that existed that we didn't look at. And, it was evaluated against how it would fit in the future. When we bought Flying Tiger, I'm trying to remember, there were, I forget how many DC-8s. There was like 10 or 12 DC-8s. And they were all the 70 series re-engined with the CFM. And I was given the responsibility for every relationship that all the airplanes, and then every relationship the Flying Tiger had with UPS, which they were like this. So we had to unwind all of that. But all of those airplanes, 6 of those DC-8s went to UPS, and we sold them to them. The rest of them went to Michael Chowdhury and with Polar. And that was the benchmark of their fleet for a long time. But a lot of interesting stories behind that with the Tiger guys and Chowdhury as well that we don't need to go into now.
It'll be for the next one, for the next time.
For the next one.
For the next time, that's right. Yeah, for the time on wing after hours.
The seminal thing for me later at FedEx, in 1984, Fred came to me and said, look, you're doing a great job buying and selling airplanes. And by that time, by the way, we'd sold 30 of the 32 remaining Falcons. But he said, you've done a great job. How would you like to set up a company to buy and sell airplanes outside of FedEx? And I said, yes. So we started Federal Express Aviation Services, FEASY for short.
Oh, okay.
And FEASY, a couple things. In 82, before the actual company was formed, we were trying to get data on what was going on in the airplane trading business. There was nothing available. McDonnell Douglas had this guy by the name of Bo Lundquist, who would collect data and assemble this printout about this thick, but there was no way to manipulate that data. So I hired Steve Fortune from Lockheed, sent him Juan O'Callahan, who was the guru at Guinness Peak, agreed to have Steve be at their place for 6 months and live with them. Steve learned how they were tracking availability of airplanes and so forth, came back. Then we hired another group of software engineers and came up with a database that incorporated Lundquist's database and produced what was called the CJF, Commercial Jet Fleet. And that was the first, we sold it outside FedEx and to anybody. We had a lot of customers. And Garrick, you would appreciate this, but that became very successful. And we had a monthly 2 volumes of all the world's fleet of airplanes. And then we had a monthly listing availability as well. Long story short there, we sold that later. It's now what Aviation Week has as their product. But we had to have that data. There was no other place to get it at that point in time. We were the first to have it. And because of having that data, it gave us a leg up. So now we start this new company. The deal was we only bought airplanes that if we messed up with, FedEx could take. So having that backstop was very important. So we ended up buying about 28 different airplanes, 727s and DC-10s, and of which I think FedEx ended up taking maybe only 2 of those airplanes. But I got a taste of blood in my teeth at that point in time. And the finance folks at FedEx decided that that was not a core business, so we wouldn't do that anymore. So that's when I departed FedEx. Now, lots of great things happened. I love the company. And I started a company called Intrepid Aviation. And that was in 1992. For 2 years, did nothing but brokerage work for financial institutions and did some work for Jeff Niddle, Andy Ostella, and a few other folks. But late August of 94, I'm laying on the sofa at the house, the phone rings. It's Fred Smith. He says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to make a living and doing fairly well." He says, "You're never going to do well unless you own the airplanes. So come over." So I went over to his house. We shared a bottle of wine, and that launched the real Intrepid at that point. And Fred became the capital behind Intrepid. And the thesis was to find passenger airplanes that would make good freighters later, acquire them subject to lease so that we didn't have downtime to fool with, and then line up for conversions and so forth. And we ended up doing 42 airplanes, most of which were 7.2s, but we did 9 A300 600s as well. And this was after FedEx had quit buying 7.2, so it was not an issue with them. Ultimately, years later, it became a potential issue, so I had to buy him out because of potential conflict of interest. But during that time period, Intrepid, as I said, owned 42 airplanes. And if you want me to continue with Intrepid's history.
Please do. I mean, you just keep throwing. I mean, obviously, I'll just interrupt for a brief second. I spent 4 years with Back Aviation. And so that's when you threw the Bo Lundquist name out there. I'm like, yeah, I remember that. I remember the books. I remember when we ultimately made the decision, to stop doing the books. Oh my goodness. It was like we were just basically kind of taking people's kids away. It was just, what do you mean you're not going to print the book? And but it's online. You can get it. It's just everything is there. So it didn't matter. It did not matter because everybody wanted those books. Yeah. So I'm right there with you, which is great. It's great to kind of hear those names again. But keep going with Intrepid. I mean, obviously, I didn't realize that Fred was kind of the money behind that when you guys really kind of got going.
And the single thing about, I mean, Fred has so many facets to him. First and foremost, he loves airplanes, and he loves airplane deals. And so while I was at FedEx, after FESI was formed, I had been reporting up until that point in time to the head of operations, Air Ops, who was Jim Riedmeyer, who was another legend at FedEx. And by the way, I stand on the shoulders of so many people. I would not be here with these heroes that were behind me. And Jim Riedmeyer was one. Obviously, Fred Smith. There's a guy named Ron Wickens at FedEx who's a legendary engineer, but I'm here because of them. But back to Fred for a minute. He knows more about airplanes and the airplane market today than anybody on the planet. I mean, right now, today. And the call that I got that afternoon, about once a month today, 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, the phone will ring. Vaughn, it's Fred. What are you doing? Come on over to share a glass of wine. So I'll go over. We'll gossip about airplanes for a couple of hours, have some nice wine. And but having him as a partner, not just for the financial side, but understanding what's going on was invaluable. And of course, from a timing perspective, that also became a conflict because he didn't need to be focusing on anything outside of FedEx at the time. But we remain great friends. But that led to a new era for Intrepid. In 2006, we associated with a private equity group called Reservoir Capital in New York. And what we were going to do, same thesis, buy used airplanes that would make great freighters. Well, things were changing, as you both know, about that point in time. And the availability, one of your questions was, what is one of the things that changed aviation?
Yeah.
The thing for me that changed aviation forever is having all this information that was kind of proprietary, ubiquitous to the world. So being able to find deals that were based on relationships alone and things were, they were supplanted by this universal access to data. But we associated with Reservoir. They committed to $450 million in equity for Intrepid at that point in time. And I was at the Washington Redskins football game in Pete Seidlitz's suite, and Barry Eccleston from Airbus was there. And Barry came up behind me, put his arm around my shoulder. He says, "What are you guys doing?" And I said, "Well, we're still buying used airplanes." He says, "You don't need to buy used airplanes. You need to buy new." Well, what do you got in mind? He says, "Well, we're developing a A330 freighter. And we had been looking at converting A340s at that point in time into freighters." But he said, and I said, "Well, they're too expensive." And he says, "Well, what if they were this price?" And I did one of those. And so the next week, a good part of Toulouse was in Memphis, and we started negotiating. This was in fall of 2006. And first thing I had to do was convince Reservoir, these used airplanes we were talking about, there's a better deal on new airplanes. So that was a seismic occurrence. Successful in doing that. And we signed an LOI with Airbus to buy 20 airplanes in December 30th of 2006. Well, now 2007 rolls around and things are starting to change worldwide, economics-wise, but we signed the agreement with Airbus at the Paris Air Show in 2007. And these were all speculative airplanes. There was nobody behind the curtain. And the PDP payments, again, having speculative airplanes, trying to arrange PDP financing was a fairly chore. And at that point in time, I'd hired Jim Selberg, who joined me at Intrepid in 2001. And he, as the CFO, he came from a bond trading side. Dad was a pilot at FedEx. But Jim and I worked on the PDP financing, got it all arranged with a group of European banks. And then the Lehman Brothers went under in September, and all financings were thrown out the door. So we had to jump back in, revisit the same banks, go through all the same things, closed on the PDP financing on December 30th of 2007. Fast forward again, 2008, in January, the air freight market goes boom, off of a cliff.
Yeah.
And we are looking at each other going, what are we going to do with all these airplanes? And so we spent about 2 years trying to work with Airbus. Airbus had no cargo group at that point in time, zero. And so I sat down with Leahy and I said, John, we can't do this. We have to have your help to develop this market and develop this airplane. So what does he do? He appoints a passenger guy to run the cargo group. And, you know, it's one of those things, what the hell were you thinking? Now, turns out, guy did fine. But we recognized that the situation, first off, when we bought those airplanes, the thought we had, the 330-200 was the wrong airplane. It had to be the 330-300. And the idiots, the non-cargo people at Airbus didn't get that a general market freighter of that size would never work. It had to be an express freighter, and it had to have more volume. So I have just about got John. I knew John from his days at Piper. So we'd been friends. So I finally got him where he was seriously considering it. I'm in Toulouse at dinner with him and the head engineer for Airbus. And John says, we could do this, because I know what the non-recurring was for the 200 that we spent so far was somewhere around $150 million. Engineer's face turned white. And he says, no, sir, it was 500. What? It was 500.
Yeah.
John's face goes red. And dinner stops. He picks up his phone. He's got everybody. They have a meeting the next morning. What had happened was, after 9/11, they shut the program down, but they had people continue to work. And all these costs were building up so that, you know, the hard iron stuff that I've done the last couple of years, but you had all these other years there.
Yeah.
So into that story was John comes to me, he says, we can't spend another dime on this airplane. So we were forced to deal with the 200. Ultimately, long story short, all of those 20 airplanes were converted to passenger airplanes and sold as passenger airplanes. So,
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Now, when did the 330 factory freighter finally launch, right? Because it's, at this time, did they have the chin?
yes,
Yeah,
the
from the
nose-
beginning.
Yep. That
2010.
Was, yeah, it was
Okay,
yeah,
so
2010, yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but
They only sold 35.
Yeah, I know. Just and yet now the converted freighter is going to be a great airplane, right?
And if they built
Yeah.
a frigging 300 as a factory freighter, they'd had Boeing by this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I. So this is the fascinating thing about the freighter market is it's two very different markets, right? Among all the other sub-markets in there, right? You've got weight and you've got volume, and the two aren't necessarily linked, right? Look at today it's the 777 freighter actually has both, but the 300 has volume but no weight. But even back in the day, during my days at DHL, right? You know, we had the 76 that was producing, you know, those kind of volumes. The 72 was phenomenal. Just pack it. We weren't anywhere near payload limitations.
Yeah.
And yet you had the 330 with the shortened fuse, right? I think the only airplane, if I'm not mistaken, the only airplane that really excelled in the heavy freight market that didn't in the express market was probably the 747.
That's right. And the key there is so many of those airplanes were operated by combination carriers who could subsidize what was going as belly freight over to what was main deck freight. And they intermixed things and blended the yield. And if you were a pure ass heavy freight carrier like Cargolux and others, you didn't have that benefit. And those guys have done a remarkable job in managed yield and the product that they've done over time. But were you at DHL when Gordon Olson was there and Terry Nord?
No, it was 2007 to 2008. So this was post Airborne, kind of the A-Star spinoff. So we were managing those contracts, right? DC, I was network planning with a lot of 727s, obviously all 200s, but DC-9s, mostly 30s, a handful, I think 40s. DC-8, we had a couple DC-8 63s still that had 4 fuel to smoke exchangers hanging under that airplane, and a lot of 73s, and that, I mean, we just kept just shoving stuff into those and they would just take them. But that was during that time that you mentioned, kind of 2008 when everything kind of fell off a cliff. And freight or cargo tends to lead the economic downturns, lag as they come out. But yeah, that was my short stint on the express side.
And you mentioned that. Take a look at what's happening today with cargo being so soft, and talk about an indicator. So,
if only somebody mentioned that early, Garrick. Could you imagine? We've been watching that closely.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable thing with the 737-800. And you could see this from day one when 90% of the airplanes being converted were lessors, not the users of the airplanes. And if you look back 10 years, there may have been 40 737 freighters flying. Now, all of a sudden, we have 180 or whatever it is out there flying. And it can't be. And again, you're back to cost per pound. And if you've got the yield to support a small airplane, but if you don't, it will kill you. Yeah. So,
and this is to kind of your original point. I mean, the 7.3 is now too small. Even the 800. The 800 is too small. And I think, again, the 7.4 excluded, the express market is required. Like it is the kind of pathfinder for these aircraft. Not that the 738 is not an amazing freighter. It is. It's just too small for the express carriers. The smallest airplane now is a 7.5. It's about to be the 7.6, right? So, a 7.3 doesn't, well, ATRs aside, but that many 7.3s. I mean, we look at the market, really like Latin America as a market for the 7.3s. How many do you need? I think everybody got excited when Amazon took some 738s, and they'll probably fly those, but they stopped, right?
Yeah, that was for a hot second.
And you know what they're taking now? A330s.
Yeah, the 7.3, the yield of an Amazon product is sub-basement, and it won't support that kind of airplane. So
they move air. Like, have you ever opened like those? Yeah, that's what's. Imagine, I even during my time, there was still. I mean, it was late in the process of the shift from kind of letter to kind of high density documents, express documents to parcels, to boxes, right? Where you really kind of lost a lot of density that just drove more need for volume of the aircraft. But now it's that and then some, right? I mean, that trend just has continued, and the yields fall with it, right? Because it's air.
It's air. It doesn't bring you any revenue. So, before I want to talk a little bit about Alpha.
Very much, yes.
Yeah, that's gonna be my next question.
In 2012, because of the conversion of all those airplanes, cargo airplanes, into passenger airplanes, that's not my gig. It's not my market. And we had put together, that's one of the things in my career, I think that I've had some good fortune with. I have managed to put together groups, first at FedEx. I had the most incredible group at FedEx, as I say, standing on people's shoulders. And the legacy that group has left will never be forgotten. The same thing in Intrepid. We had such an incredible group of people. But it became a point for both Jim Selberg, who I mentioned, my CFO, and I, where we're not passenger airplane people. So it was time for us to leave. And for a brief period of time, I worked both with Jim and a guy that Garrett, Steve Harsht, with Veloz Aviation. And Veloz had two projects. We were looking at taking FedEx's MD-1030s and converting them into tankers and flying them for the military. And it had all the right reasons. The amount of money the U.S. military would have saved would have paid for the B-21 program. They're operating the KCs, 135s. The maintenance cost alone per hour on that airplane is $25,000. That's just the maintenance cost.
Wow.
And you figure, well, suffice to say, the military had new airplane-itis, so we didn't get real far with that. We also worked with acquiring a fleet of 767s from JAL and ANA to then parlay into one of the integrators. The problem at that point in time, which would have been 2013 and 14, is Boeing couldn't deliver 787s. They had the grounding because of the battery fire. So JAL and ANA wanted no part of committing to get rid of their airplanes. So Steve and I waved at each other, who's still one of my best friends, by the way.
Yeah.
Jim had started Alpha already, and towards focusing on used engines, midlife to end of life engines. And he, along with a fellow named Mark Lenzik, who's the head of sales for Alpha, came to me and said, why don't you join with us? And because of your background and so forth, and let's go at this market in a way where we identify where we can make money, which is very important, and still have some fun. So Alpha has, for the last 7 years, focused on the Pratt 4000, the GE 80C2, V2500s. Those have been the primarily focus. And we've done that with strategic partners, which, again, very important. GA Telesis is a strategic partner of ours. NTU is a strategic partner. We also branched out into 737-800 and 767 landing gears. And our strategic partner there is LGT down in Miami. And then we started tearing apart CF 56-7s, and A&E in Miami is our strategic partner on that. So our core business are these engines, both in leasing, green time engines, time on wing, and
nice.
That was great.
But green time engines, and we part out a lot of engines, and we have most of that inventory consigned between most of it at GA, but some to A&E on the CFM side. And we are cautiously acquiring assets. But back to what we talked about earlier, this ubiquitous knowledge of what's going on in the market today makes finding unique situations very difficult. So, the folks at Intrepid, there are 4 partners that we have a lot of consultants that we use. And it's not our gig to be, we don't have a staff of people that are doing the consignment sales of our inventory. We let GA and A&E do that for us. And in terms of we're out looking for assets, and the biggest piece of it is just identifying what asset can make us money that has a market. So we just have to be very cautious about what we do. We are getting ready to move into a new product, which I won't mention right now, but we are very excited about that. We have a new equity infusion that will allow us to participate at a level which we've not had since I left Fred. But
that's great.
which is very important. And but it's it's not the wild west. It's an organized chaos somewhat, but it's still got a lot of organization, and such great companies come out. My AirCap, what they've done is just nothing short of phenomenal, and I think that from that perspective, we bought a lot of stuff from AirCap. Thank you very much. So they're one of our good vendors, but it's a time. I want to get in. We haven't talked about ISTAT, and I want to talk a little bit about ISTAT. Back in 1982, and Garrett, I think I mentioned this to you down in Miami. Avmark, which was a company owned by Mort Beyer and Jordan Green, and they held the first conferences that were in the used aircraft and associated items business, and the first one was in Miami. And they had asked me to speak, which I did, and I spoke about the 727 at that point in time. But I had a set of index cards that had an airplane and a description of the airplane, time remaining, and so forth. And there were 5 so-called appraisers there, which I won't name any names, and I handed those cards out, and I said, how would you value this airplane? Well, the disparity between those appraisals was off the chart. And
so what you're saying is nothing's changed in the last 40 years. Full circle.
But about 3 or 4 weeks later, there were a group of us met up in New York, and I don't remember all the people that were there. Andy Ostella, Jeff Niddle, George Dutton from Eastern, Mort Beyer, and there were probably 12 or 15 people to me. We set out at that point in time, we've got to come up with a means to, number one, provide conferences to the people out there who need this information at a price point that is something that everybody can afford. Secondly, we've got to come up with some standards of appraisals that keep people lined up in the way that need to be done. And so out of that sprung the whole idea of ISTAT. Initially, there was also some thought about ISTAT becoming a lobbying influence. That kind of fell away by the wayside, unfortunately, to some extent. But, at that point, it was pretty much people just trading airplanes. The financial institutions were very few and far between that were involved in airplanes at that time, which now has gone the other way. But and so we elected George Dutton as the first president of ISTAT, and we had hired an outside group to manage it from the get-go, and that didn't go well for a couple of years. And so we had to I'm not going to mention the guy's name, we had to let him go, and we hired another guy and another outside group to manage. That didn't go well. So I had the opportunity I was the second president of ISTAT. Over that 2-year period, I got to fire 2 different people.
Oh, wow. And
then out of that, though, came pretty much how it's grown to be where it is. But it was so simple then, easy to manage, and great people there. After me, Dick Spalding was the president of ISTAT. And George and Dick and I stayed involved as directors after that point in time for several years. And what it's now become is just absolutely amazing when you look at it. And great efforts by people like Mike Platt and Jeff Thornton and others have taken it to new heights. And, Dean Gerber and now Mary Prettyman are all doing a fantastic job. But it was, watching it grow and develop over the years it's been very interesting in terms of where it started. And I think that's the type of commitment. You had one of your questions about what do you have to be in this industry. First off, passion. And if you don't have passion for it, you have no business being involved with it. I mean, everybody needs a job, but if you're going to do something and accomplish something, you have to have a passion. And then secondly, you got to give back. And the people at ISTAT now who give back and training all these young people and so forth, that's again what it was founded to be. So, it's really become an incredible organization. I'd like to see them lower their prices on the fees for the conferences.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I know. We were just talking about that because it's true. It's kind of like, wait, what? Why are we paying all this money for these conferences? But
crazy.
Yeah, it is. It really is. I think it's as much as I think we appreciate the events and the networking opportunities and everything else, I think it's kind of like, well, why is ISTAT becoming more of an events organization? I think as you said, everything else that ISTAT does in terms of the, ISTAT University and, kind of getting, younger people interested in aviation, the scholarship. I mean, there's so many things, the connection with also Airlink. I mean, to me, that's all fantastic. And the events are also great, but it's like, okay, I think, they've become so big and that's one thing that I think Courtney and I try to use to our benefit to kind of offer, different things to the industry that people don't offer. But we definitely see that the lack of what I would call useful information, right? I mean, you go to conferences these days and it's really just all about the networking because the panels, it's all public companies because they're all the sponsors and they don't tell you anything. And so, what's interesting is, if you go back to, the mid 80s when you were talking about, you created ISTAT because there was this inconsistency and lack of data, which I think at that point, I'm trying to think when Form 41 was still a thing, right? Where all of a sudden, you had...
I mean, it was there before, but yeah.
As appraisers, right, you had, I think, some level of, oh, this is what airlines are paying. And then in the mid-90s, airlines went, no thank you. This is, it's not helping our cause. So they did away with it. I think ISTAT was a proponent of trying to keep that going. But then since then, I think, as you say, the opportunities that are out there are challenging to find. And so I think the lessor community, which is the one that trades the most, is unwilling to share in that because it obviously it affects their abilities to do deals. And I get it. But, as an appraiser, you have to, it all goes back to, at the end of the day, relationships. That's what drives our business. But it is kind of interesting how things have developed over the years and the increase in data that makes things still hard to determine. There's so much data out there, but it doesn't really tell you much, right?
Well, it's so different, and I think this is why I love talking to. I'll call you a pioneer, even though I know things were happening before you got there, but yeah, look, I mean, you talked about kind of the edge that you were able to find back in the day, which was collecting the information and the data. That's very different now. You mentioned that it's ubiquitous. It absolutely is. Today, it's more about knowing what you can throw away and what to actually pay attention to. Of course, everybody's so excited about artificial intelligence. Work with a fair amount of those models myself, but I would make the argument that the edge is really right where you're sitting, right? The relationships, understanding the industry to not only the fundamental workings of the industry, but the fundamental workings of the personalities that affect the industry.
Yeah.
One thing that really strikes me when you tell your stories that I love, by the way, is you use names. And that's kind of a bygone, that's from a bygone era, right? Because we didn't necessarily, even early in my career, it wasn't, or whenever I do business in Latin America, it's still very much like this. You don't think of airlines, you think of names, right? You think of the names of the people. And I think that's becoming a bit of a lost art. And kind of a lost area, just how people are going to compete with one another. And I love hearing these stories from back in the day. I think there's just, well, here's the question. When does your book come out?
Well, I have a daughter that's in a production company who has written a couple books. She's been all over my case. And before we get off, I want to tell you one final story. We'll save that for the end. But she's she's been after me, and I've outlined it, and I've committed that I turned 75 next year. So, but before I turn 75, we're going to have a draft of the book done. So
I've got
Nice.
the name for you.
okay.
Shenanigans. Just shenanigans. That's it. That's all you need. Just shenanigans. By Ron Anderson.
I think that's great. You heard it here first, folks. That's right. Yeah. No, but it's, I mean, look, to echo, Courtney's point, I think, when you talk to the younger generation that's moving into the industry today, that's lost, right? It's all about, well, what did I read online? And it's not about that. You need to talk to people, right? And that's where, that's what we love about what we do, is meeting with people and talking about other passionate.
Podcast.
We should do a podcast. I know, yeah, right. But it's true. Like all of our business is driven by, people appreciate when you go visit them and you talk about stuff. And it's not just here's all the products that we're selling. It's more just kind of like here's what we think, right? And that's why Courtney and I, earlier this year, we launched the Aircraft Intelligence Monthly, right? The AIM, which is it kind of picks up on like things that we feel people are missing. But those are the things that people really like, because it's not just, it's something that you saw online, or you saw it on LinkedIn, or you saw it on, in a panel. It's like, yeah, everybody knows that. Everybody knows everything. So how do you find the things that people don't necessarily pick up on? And I think that's the stuff that's really interesting. And you don't get that unless you talk to people, right? Or you talk to somebody.
That's
and
why.
Yeah. I mean, talking to you at lunch in Miami, I was like, wow, I need to talk to this guy more, because in 15 minutes, I'm like, I'm sorry, what did you say? I heard FedEx in there. I heard Fred Smith, and I'm like, wow, okay.
In summary, what Garrick is saying is go finish your book and only give it to us.
Yeah. We'll preview it. We'll do a kind
Sure.
of, yeah, we can read it beforehand and we'll give you thoughts.
I do want to hear this last story though.
Well, can you give me 1 sec? I need to look up something very quickly.
Yeah, of
I don't
course.
screw this up.
Wait a minute. Wasn't this whole conversation about not having to look things up? And
Yeah.
Well, but you're dealing with an old man. So
that's why I hang out with Garrick. He makes me feel young.
forget it. Anyway, we had made the decision to sell the Falcons at FedEx, and I went for a year, sold nothing. And so what the hell can we do? Corporate jet freighter. So we took one of them and went up to Bournemouth and hired a company. When the airplane was made in Marignac in Bordeaux, it was alongside of the Mirage jet fighter. And so there were hard points on the wing. So we took one of the airplanes, painted it in camouflage colors, put some fake panels for instrumentation and so forth, for guiding rockets and so forth. We hung 2 fake missiles on the hard points off the wing, put it to Paris Air Show. So here's this airplane sitting out there, camouflage, big cargo door open, passenger interior reinstalled in it as well. And so I go out the first morning. A group of guys are doing it, but I go up my first stint that day. Next to it was the F-20. And Northrop had decided to spec a fighter, which they couldn't sell to anybody. And so they had the fighter on display. So I had a couple of minutes. So I walked over, and guy standing there in front of the F-20. I said, I'm Ron Anderson. He said, I'm Chuck Yeager.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we were talking about inability to sell airplanes, but long story short, at the air show, we sold 10 airplanes. So
Wow. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
were those in military configuration when they were sold, or?
no, they were well, 3 of them went to the Portuguese Air Force. Mm-hmm. And let's see, 3 went to the Portuguese Air Force, and then the Venezuelan Air Force took some of them as well. Ultimately, 10 more went to flight refueling in Bournemouth, and they converted them into target towing vehicles for use training fighters on targets. And they are still flying today, by the way. Wow. Of those 33 original airplanes, 1 was destroyed. 24 of them are still flying.
Okay, wait a minute. So these went out as target airplanes and nobody could hit them?
Well, they had drones, and they
They would drag the drones behind the airplanes.
Yes.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, that's different. Interesting.
Oh yeah, one airplane. No.
Yeah. Wow. How do you get that job? Be like, so we want you to get into this airplane. You're going to be dragging another airplane that they're going to try to shoot down. And they might, if they miss it, they might hit you. But don't worry about it. Just keep going. Just keep flying. You'll be fine. Right? I mean, how does that work? Wow.
Well, they're still flying.
Yeah, they're still flying, right? So pretty good pilots, I guess, that flew the airplanes.
And there was a group in Burbank that got 5 or 6 of the airplanes that used them to transport checks for the Federal Reserve, which that became a dying business at some point. But no, it was, as I say, a year, and I couldn't sell a thing, and then boom. And within a year after that, we'd sold every one of them. One went to the Smithsonian, the Hazy Museum, which was 10FE, which was named after Fred's first daughter, Wendy. His second daughter, Lauren, they decided they were going to put 8FE into the museum there at Memphis. We had sold 8FE, except I couldn't tell Fred Smith that. So we re-registered one of the unsold airplanes as 8FE, and you're hearing it here today. 8FE is not the right aviation.
That's great.
Wait, does Fred know? He does.
Well, he will if he listens to this podcast. So, I mean,
your secret's pretty safe.
I think your secret's safe. Just don't spread it around. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's crazy.
That's phenomenal. Okay, so where's 8FE then?
It's Memphis. They have a center there for tours that they bring in to go on hub tours. And 8FE is
not the new one.
Oh, the real one.
The original.
The real, yeah.
The OG.
I don't know, but I will find out. I'll let you know.
Yeah. So
it was sold to Devarian, which was the Czech carrier, but I don't know where it went after it left Devarian.
Sure.
So,
yeah, wow,
what
that's
a great
crazy.
Story.
I know, yeah. So I'll ask you one more question, then I know we've taken up a lot of your time, but from what you do today, I think what is your biggest challenge in the current environment? What do you see as your biggest challenge, kind of for the next several years, 5, 10 years, whatever it is? But
it's continuing the business that Alpha has developed in this new product line engine that we're about to get into, and being able to find the same opportunities that we have with the other airplanes. And that is probably not a good foundation, because the way things change, foundations need to change as well. So the way we go at marketing this new product and determining which products to buy, because we're out looking for part out, but also green time engines. So is everybody else. And so how do we differentiate ourselves? One is to move into a product that's so expensive that most of the people don't want to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we're going. And this new equity infusion that I mentioned was very timely for us. And it's to Jim Selberg's credit that we have found that. So, but we, and it's to have fun at what we do. And
that's like I tell Garrick when asked what I do, I earn enough to subsidize my conference habit, my ISTAT habit.
Yeah.
And
it's true, right?
My aviation habit, really.
Yeah.
I have. Go ahead, please.
I said, quick secret for you: if you want cheaper prices from ISTAT, become president, because then you get it free.
Done. I'm gonna sign up. Yep. Which, you know what? Unfortunately, as an appraiser, I cannot run for president because I'm stuck to the appraiser group.
Yeah, they're not trustworthy.
Yeah,
you don't want them as presidents.
So one of the drawbacks.
Question, through all of these stories, really the question that I have for you is, what are you most proud of, kind of through this journey that is professional aviation for you?
I think it's being involved in developing the different groups of people that I had at FedEx and Intrepid, and now at Alpha. And I'm at Alpha, I'm more the strategy guy, the 35,000 foot, looking out into the future and so forth. but we have some amazing people. But career wise, I would have to say it's again those teams that I was able to build, and having the freedom at both companies to do that, was important. So,
yeah, wow, yeah. Which, you know what I mean, we seem to always come back to people, right? I mean, every podcast that we do, every person that we talk to, get back to it is about the people, and that's why we keep doing what we're doing. So, and we keep having fun. And are you going to take out another? What are you doing?
You've read this, right?
Hard Landing. No, I have not.
You should. It is all it takes. It goes through
the
a lot
history
of pictures. Of
pictures
commercial
or
aviation. No? It has some great pictures, but we're talking
who wrote
Ed
it?
Acker, Juan Tripp, Thomas Petzinger. So this is like each of my employees, I would give this. It kind of runs through the start of commercial aviation through kind of the early 1990s. But Frank Lorenzo and Charles Lindbergh and the whole Alpha sagas during that time. But you lived this. Like I don't know I think there's some FedEx in there actually, come to think of it.
Yeah.
Frank Lorenzo came to Memphis to visit Fred Smith one time. And Fred said, would you go over to the airport and pick Frank up? So I go to the airport, I'm at the gate, and the door opens up and one of the pilots comes running out of the airplane, runs up to the guy there at the desk. He says, you're not going to believe what son of a bitch is on this airplane. It's that goddamn Frank Lorenzo. So Frank walks out and I said, Frank, your presence has been noticed.
That's funny. He's still around, right? Not in aviation, but he's still
That's what I understand.
Yeah. Well, it's it's hard. I find that it's very hard for people that have been in this industry, long enough to really get out of it completely, right? It's just once it's in your blood, it's hard to get out of it. You still want to be active in some way, right? It doesn't have to be, intense where you're, in the office all day and you're doing deals every day, but it's just, you just want to keep seeing what's going on, seeing what's happening, which is what makes this industry great. So
at FedEx, it's called purple blood. And if you've been there long enough, your blood turns purple.
Yeah.
But if you leave, you need to get rid of a lot of that purple blood too. Because things think different. So
yeah.
Thank y'all so much. I mean, this is so much fun. And I appreciate, as I said in the very beginning, what you're doing and why you're doing it. And the lady in our group that handles this sort of thing, I'm going to put her in contact with you because we've got a very strong presence on LinkedIn. So I want to make sure we put your podcast out on.
Well, we
too.
appreciate it. So, and look, thank you for making the time to be with us today. I checked with a few folks before I reached out to you to make sure that you would be a good candidate to be in here. And everybody said, oh, absolutely, without a doubt. And I'm glad that we were able to make this work because this was absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your time in aviation. We look forward to hopefully doing this again at another point, just kind of seeing what you're up to at that point with your new product, which will be exciting to hear about. So, and your new book, and your new book at some point.
My wife just heard that too. So,
so now
she's been all over me.
Locked in.
Done.
You can't get out of it.
Absolutely. We cannot wait. So thank you very much, Ron. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.